HOD and reader in English, appreciate the opportunity to introduce our two high-ranking resource persons. Now, as the curtain raises, introducing you Professor Dr. Saroj Kumar Padhi, Associate Professor in English, presently working at JKBK Govt College, Cuttack. He has been writing poems in English and Odia since his school days. Till date, he has published innumerable poems in most of the leading magazines of the country and abroad. He has published 2 books of criticism and 11 anthologies of poetry in English. He has done his PhD on Indian English.
मैडम आपण अनम्यूट करंतु टिके खाली मैडम आपनकर म्यूट हे गला
Yes.
से अन्य माने पार्टी करले तो मु म्यूट कर दे.
Oh. Till that, he has published innumerable poems in most of the leading magazines of the country and abroad. He has published 2 books of criticism and 11 anthologies of poetry in English. He has done his PhD on Indian English poetry from Barampur University. He is an active member of various poetry communities on the website where he regularly posts his poems. He has worked as the editor of The Phoenix and Replica and has been designated as Ambassador of Peace India branch by World Institute of Peace in 2016. He received the Rock Pebbles National Literary Award and International Enchanting Muse Award in 2017. I welcome you, sir. We are privileged to have you as our resource person. Then I take great pride introducing you a very prominent Bangladeshi academician, essayist, translator, editor, and literary critic. Such an amazing personality, Dr. Elham Hossain sir, who is at present working as Associate Professor in English in Dhaka City College. He writes both in Bangla and English. He has authored 6 books and translated a handful of short stories, essays, interviews, speeches of African, Afro-American, and Caribbean authors. A huge number of his essays, research articles have been published in journals, periodicals, and academic magazines on home and abroad. He is one of the founding members of Center of Studies in African Literature and Culture, Dhaka, having 19 years of teaching experience under National University, Bangladesh. You are most welcome, sir. It is my honor to introduce you to our participants. Now, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Dr. Saroj Padhi sir to come to this virtual platform and enlighten us by your valuable speech. Over to you, sir. Dr. Professor Saroj Kumar Padhi. Sir, unmute yourself. Sir, unmute. Saroj, sir, unmute yourself.
Okay. Good
Yes,
morning,
sir.
everybody over there. My gratitude to all of you who have organized this grand seminar or webinar. And It's a great privilege and a great delight to speak to you all, the academicians and students and teachers who have been there with a lot of teaching experience. I have selected, or we have selected, it was suggested initially by Sukanti Madam, and that you talk on globalization and its impact on poetry. So I have chosen this topic and I have tried to focus on the state of poetry in India and, as a matter of fact, in the entire globe. And the scope of this paper being very limited, I have tried to concentrate more on Indian English poetry, a little bit of Hindi poetry and some English poetry. And as you know, this is an interdisciplinary topic. Globalization and poetry, almost antagonistic to each other and like binaries. But as you know, we are under the clutches of globalization, and it is irrevocable. Globalization that has come to take us off our feet in its sweep cannot be, we cannot go back in terms of time and civilization. So the topic is impact of globalization on poetry. I believe that I am audible to all of you. As we all know, we have been living in the world of acute globalization. This is the fourth wave of globalization that has been going on since 1990 for the last 30 years. And as we pause to stop and wonder over questions like, what is the state of poetry now in the globalized world? To what extent has literature or poetry been globalized? Does poetry have a significant place in today's scheme of things? Is poetry today treated with the same love and respect as it was yesterday? Or has it been reduced to a level of being treated as an eccentricity, a mere oddity? These are some of the questions that keep bothering us today in days of acute globalization. And as we know, globalization is a sociological phenomenon. And of course, it has its impact on literature because society and literature cannot be separated. In other words, literature is also a psychological reflection of the society. And today we are faced with the most intense and tragic fallouts of globalization in the form of the pandemic. The pandemic is a fallout, an effect of globalization. And it has affected almost all the countries of the world, working at a great leveler, equalizer, and effecting great changes in man's attitude and outlook, forcing man to think and feel in a certain way which is not in tandem with old conventions. There is a significant change, a paradigm change in man's thoughts. Going through the history of human civilization, we come to learn how devastation caused by such outbreaks has always impacted major writers and poets. During these days of pandemic isolation, poets and writers have written great literature, and they have turned to art and literature because this helps them to come to terms with reality. We all are aware of the harsh realities of today and the tragic incidents that are taking place, because we come to witness a lot of death, heaps of bodies, corpses every day. But in spite of these startling and very worrying facts, the fact remains that there is also a boom in the poetry industry. Lots of quarantine poetry, pandemic poetry are being written and published during this period that reveal the nature and state of poetry, written and shared now in print and on the e-space. We know literature regards humanity with compassion. It may not explain away or fight off things like the pandemic, but it becomes a source of consolation, a way of sharing our common humanist concerns and in its own way provides the deepest and insightful record of the events. It also fights for a more equitable world in its own way. Let us discuss a few writers and poets of the past who have created such great literature during such times. To begin with, let me say the Nobel laureate of India, Rabindranath Tagore, his long narrative poem, quote, Puratan Bhritya, tells the story of a much reviled house help who nurses his master to health but succumbs to the smallpox. The great Hindi poet Sukanti Mohapatra, in his poem Nirala, says about the loss of half of his family, including his wife and daughter, in the 1918 influenza outbreak. He wrote how even the river Ganga grew heavy with the burden of the corpses. Famous Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, his novella, The Decameron, as we all of us know, is a collection of 100 tales told by a group of 7 young women and 3 young men sheltering in a secluded villa outside Florence to escape Black Death, which had taken Europe on a sweep from 1347 to 1351. Famous Odia writer Fakir Mohan Senapati's story Rebati, eminent Kannada writer U.R. Anantamurthy's novel Samskara, Albert Camus' novel The Plague, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel Love in the Time of Cholera are good examples of pestilence literature. So, with this, let us come to discuss the word globalization before we go to discuss real impact of globalization on modern poetry. So, there are 2 famous sociologists named Martin Albro and Elizabeth King who hold the view that globalization is all those processes by which the people of the world are incorporated into a single world society. We talk of global village, that concept. And another sociologist, Anthony Giddens, writes, quote, globalization can thus be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. It is the process by which people of the whole world or the whole humanity are brought under one banner economically and culturally into a world society. As we know, globalization has both the good and bad effects. Among the positive impacts we have, the most important is now 4th wave of globalization, WWW, World Wide Web. The stories of the world are your fingertips. You just touch the Google and things are there. There is an effective worldwide social relationship. The entire world has been compressed in terms of time and space. There is an intensification of world consciousness. Cultural exchanges at a greater speed take place from one language to the other language. People have become polyglot, multilingual. There are center versus margin, this binary opposition, the West versus the East, the center and the margin. These binaries have given rise to alternative discourses like feminism, subaltern studies, multiculturality, hybridity, and diaspora studies. And as you know, the language of globalization being English, my co-participant, my co-speaker, Professor Hossain, will be talking about that the hegemony of English in the third world countries or in the post-colonial countries, post-colonial times. And this hegemony of English is also the hegemony of the language. English dominates globalization. So the negative impacts are the Western things like technology, success, money, nuclear family. These are having superiority over the Eastern concepts like joint family system, peace of mind, mutual trust, spirituality, the art of enjoying life. These Eastern concepts, as you know, how they are under the onslaught, direct attack of the Western culture. Our joint family system has crumbled into pieces because of globalization. The big culture, I mean the Western culture, wallows other cultures. The other cultures are subordinated and engulfed by the big culture of the West. That is a development of the Tamasic culture. And there is a fast changing paradigm because of the permutations and commutations of ethos. The value system is changing. And the dominant ideology of the West that is having its effect on the other countries or other cultures. The less important cultures. Less important means it is considered by them. So with the emergence of globalization, our deep-rooted traditions and customs have loosened their hold. India has a rich cultural background which is famous throughout the world. Globalization has not only helped us in the westernization of India, but also conversely, the Indian culture has also spread its impact globally. Culture and traditions of any geographic region hold a special significance with respect to their uniqueness, and that is the differentiating factor for a population within a geographic boundary. The uniqueness has been disturbed in varying degrees due to globalization, because globalization tries to make everything equal. A kind of hegemonization, a kind of a monolithic status is given to everything. So such an impact is very much pronounced when they hit a developing country like India. Widespread effects ranging from environmental challenges, climatic influence, air, water, soil pollution, cyber crimes. These are the effects of being global. All areas of business, trade, work exposure, economic and financial status of a country, no field is beyond the reach of globalization. We have positive effects, no doubt. Globalization is not entirely harmful. There are positive effects like synthesis of cultures, acculturation, fellow feeling, sharing, common platform on major issues on a global level, massive literary and linguistic exchanges, and it can be failed in the literatures of the world have come to one footing, and literature of India, Indian literature in English has also become, in English and in English translation too, have become one major part of global English. Let us consider a few Indian English poets to find out their puzzlement, their dilemma, because globalization causes a lot of tension, a lot of dilemma, conflict, and there are a lot of ambivalences are also there present in the minds of the writers who try to write about their situation, about the situation of the country and about their own situation, about the situation of the state, the society. They are confronted with linguistic as well as existential dilemmas. So one of the poets that I would like to quote first is Kamala Das. As you know, she is a beautiful poet from South Malabar. And Kamala Das, in one of her poems, An Introduction, she talks about the dilemma that she faces in taking into consideration the question of language. As we know, Professor Hossain also will agree with me, and how Professor Hossain is writing in English and Bengali. Many of his co-writers will also be doing like that. I am writing in English and Odia. So if somebody is writing in English, and why should he write in his mother tongue? The question is, there is a dilemma in the mind, because all your emotions, all your feelings cannot be effectively put into a foreign tongue. Sometimes the regional language becomes a very powerful necessity because you want to express your own emotions, your darling emotions in a mother tongue can be better explained, better stated, expressed than in a foreign tongue. But there are some exceptions like Nishim Ezgiel and A.K. Ramanujan who feel very easy and the felicitousness of the language becomes more acceptable to them. They don't write in dual language. But Kamala Das has been facing this problem of linguistic dilemma. And let me read out a few lines only to state how the linguistic dilemma pervades through her poems. I quote, she says, I quote, I am Indian, very brown and born in Malabar. I speak 3 languages, write in 2, dream in 1. Don't write in English, they said. English is not your mother tongue. Why not leave me alone, critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you? Why not let me speak in any language I like? The language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its squarenesses, all mine, mine alone. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is as human as I am human. Don't you see? It voices my joys, my longings, my hopes, and it is useful to me as cawing is to crows or roaring is to lions. It is human speech, the speech of the mind that is here and not there, a mind that sees and hears and is aware, unquote. Similarly, another poet, Nishim Ezgiel, one of the founding poets, founding fathers of Indian English poetry, Nishim Ezgiel, his state of rootlessness has been a major problem area in his writings. This is the effect of globalization. Rootlessness, a feeling of rootlessness. Rootlessness has been a major concern in most of the Indian English poets. And for example, Nishim Ezgiel in his poems, he talks about how he has been rooted off his soil. But unlike V.S. Naipaul, for V.S. Naipaul and another Indian born Nobel laureate in literature, who saw India as a distant past of his. India lives only as a memory in his books like An Area of Darkness and many other book novels that V.S. Naipaul has written about India, a wounded civilization. So in those books, India is just a distant past of his. But for Nishim Ezgiel, India is felt deeply within his blood at the very moment that he is writing or speaking. He knows the country with all its complexities inherited from history, and he tries to understand it with a lot of empathy and compassion. Somehow there is an element of despair and disillusionment in his poetry. His stay in London only reinforced his belief that he belonged to India, especially to Mumbai. And in one of his poems, I quote, background casually, he writes about his rootlessness. He says, I quote, I went to Roman Catholic school, a mocking Jew among the wolves. They told me I had killed the Christ. That year, I won the scripture prize. A Muslim sportsman boxed my ears, unquote. So his background, Ben is Israeli. That background also has given a lot of feeling of rootlessness to him. And he has suffered a lot with this kind of cultural rootlessness, and that is revealed through his poems. Another important poem from India, A.K. Ramanujan, in his brilliant and intellectual person, he has cleverly tried to hide his true feelings and presents a philosophically detached and cool front to the world. He gives a glimpses of his traditionally rich Tamil Brahmin childhood, and he has a way of expressing his nostalgia through the metaphor of family, which he uses extensively in his poems. He carries his past with him as an inner world of memories which erupt into the present. As Ramanujan moves in the foreign country, he feels himself like a plucked fruit, plucked away from his family. He has to start a new life, make a fresh beginning in a new atmosphere. But he finds it difficult to accommodate in the new environment and hence suffers from rootlessness. The Western world, its culture, its style, its values have made the search for the self difficult. Standing between two worlds, the land of his birth and the land of his domicile, England, Ramanujan feels insulated from his own origin. So I quote a few lines from Ramanujan. He says, I quote, "Not knowing who I am and what I want, I roam the city, walk into movies, hustle down a roller coaster," unquote. This roller coaster ride is the symbolic or metaphoric representation of his life in England. He is bewildered and not sure who he is, and thereby suffers from an identity crisis. As you know, search for the self becomes a very dominant theme in most of the poets or writers, especially the Indian English writers, the diasporic writers, the writers who have changed their place of domicile from one country to the migrant writers. And again he says, I quote, "I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger," unquote. So the portrait of the stranger speaks about he himself. Because he looks at the mirror, he cannot identify himself. He himself appears to be a stranger to himself. Similarly, we have another interesting poet from India, R. Parthasarathy, whose rough passage got the Academy Award, records his experience of alienation and desire for reintegration into a cultural tradition. He feels like a cat on a hot tin roof in an alien foreign land, and a sense of futility and loneliness overwhelms him. The strength he got from his Tamil past and Tamil language is gone. The introspective study shapes him and makes him understand the loneliness of his dream about England, and that gives him disenchantment and disillusionment with his early English utopia. So the honeymoon with England comes to an abrupt end. So he feels, I quote from his poem, "There is something to be said for exile. You learn roots are deep. That language is a tree, loses under another sky." So Ramanujan's this metaphor, language is a tree, language is a metaphor of tree, and loses under another sky. So language loses its importance under another ecological system or sphere. So this is what he talks about, the inefficacy of English language. It is unable to express his Tamil roots, Tamil origin. His origin, Tamil origin or his Tamil original ethos has not been effectively written through the English language. Hence, he returns and he says, I quote, "I return to the city I had quarreled with." So the honeymoon with a foreign culture, foreign ethos, foreign language, and again return. This wavering, this going to and fro, this dilemma of being here and there, and not feeling satisfied with one language, again turning to another language, being multilingual, bilingual, trilingual. These are the manifestations of our responses to globalization. Sukanti Mohapatra, another important poet from India. He belongs to Odisha, all of you know, and he was the first person to get Sahitya Academy Award in 1981, the first Indian to get award for Indian English poetry. His relationship is an important document of how we, the Odias, are related to our soil, our cultural roots. And that thing has been portrayed through the lines of relationship, which is a conscious attempt at reconciliation and association with the past. Time and again, he gives voice to his desire of redeeming the past from the rot it has fallen into and to recapture it in all its glory. He is able to link up the land of myths and traditions with his own psyche. He wants to bury himself in this mysterious land of myth and tradition that is stated at the beginning of the long poem, Relationship. I quote a few lines. He says, once again, one must sit back and bury the face in this land of the forbidding myth, and to clasp the slow slopes of stone again that ascend to the realm of the dead, slopes that stroke the mind with their quiet faces of sorrow, unquote. The assimilation is complete and the relationship is established once the poet and the artisans, the 1200 artisans who built the Konark temple, the artisans of humorous edifices of Odisha, become indistinguishable and one. The poet rakes up the hidden ashes of the past, which lie buried under the glorious present. And I quote a few more lines from him. He says, for our lives are only of the deeds of dreams, forgetting the cruelties and ruthless emperors who carved peaceful edict on blood-red rock, forgetting our groans and cries. Look at the irony involved in these lines. The emperors built peaceful edicts, forgetting our groans and cries. They committed crimes of bloodshed and horror, King Ashok, and then they built peaceful edicts. This irony of history, we are a part, we are an instrument in the hands of time, we play into the hands of time. This is how the irony of history has been represented in the poem Relationship, an epic poem which talks about our relationship with the land of Ashok, Odisha. So another important poet, Mina Alexander, she has died, very important poet. She is a diasporic writer. She worked most of the time in Hunter College in USA. And she has explored themes of feminism, post-colonialism, dislocation, memory, and many more. She published numerous volumes of poetry, about 11 collections of poetry, 2 novels and a memoir named Fault Lines. Her writings were themselves the subject of the book. There is a book written by, edited by Lopamudra Basu and Cynthia Linnartz. A book's name is Passage to Manhattan, where they say that Mina Alexander is known for creating a new hybrid poetic form, which fuses the Western Romantic style lyric tradition with non-Western ones of Bhakti and Sufi poetry. So the Indian and the Western have been amalgamated, have been merged, mingled. And this is the effect of globalization, as we find in Mina Alexander's poetry. So the modern Indian poet was able to have an access to the world through English language, because English language was the language of globalization. The hegemony of English is always there, which we cannot do away with, we cannot wish away, which offered to him many new challenges and opened areas of common opportunities and possibilities. By and large, these poets were not tormented by the idea of writing in an alluvial language. Ramanujan confessed that he just happened to write in English. Kamaladas, you have already seen, I have discussed in a house, he says, don't ask me about my language, I write in any language I like. Whether it is, she was, of course, a bilingual writer, and she was nominated for Nobel Prize, though she didn't get it. And as you know, Jayanta Mohapatra writes in English because he says that I have tremendous love for the language. I have been taught in the English language in my schools, and he has a felicity with the language, which many others may not have. Nissim Ezkiel had chosen English as the medium because he cannot write, he could not have written in any other language. It is only Parthasarathy, the writer of Rough Passage, who, although in love with the language, laments the lack of any real tradition of writing in English be compared with other languages like Tamil. So in India, because English didn't have a long tradition of writing in English, when Parthasarathy felt that English was not efficient enough to express his emotions, his cultural ethos, as a result of which he experimented both the language, English and Tamil. Parthasarathy feels that an Indian poet in English feels alienated to evaluate his own work. So the poet is conscious of his Indianness, which reflects a crisis of identity. The tension of using a foreign language with its lack of roots in the local environment becomes the main theme of Rough Passage, his magnum opus for which he got the prize. Parthasarathy feels the language has an ecology. Language is a tree which loses color under a different sky. His feelings of pain, guilt, ambivalence, and alienation run through Rough Passage, and it is a different story that this tension has helped him to create better pieces of poetry. Because unless there is tension, there can be no poetry. And dear Sukanti will agree with me that poetry cannot be there without tension, creative tension. Ramanujan is one of the poets who has handled the divided heritage, Indian and Western, so well. He, through his work, showed how the Indian poets could effectively be both modern and be able to walk through their traditions by employing the technique of using his South Indian Brahmin roots as a source, contrasting it with his life in America. And this is how he has combined both the areas. It is a technique Ramanujan had learned from his study of older Kannada poets, and who blended Indian and European models into a new form. So these important poets like Ramanujan, Ezkiel, Parthasarathy, and Mina Alexander, they have really they have shown how under the influence of English language, or the English language, the language of globalization, has been an positive instrument in their hands, as well as an instrument of dilemma. The sense of oppression and isolation, pain of being ruthless, and psychological conflicts seem to dominate in the process of globalization, leaving barely any space for higher vision. It is one of the basic instincts of human beings to have a transcendent vision, some idealized goal. Why poetry? If we are all globalized and we are having all our KFC chicken, we are our burgers and this and that under the globalized situation. So why this poetry? Because poetry is one such medium that keeps alive the transcendent vision of man. It keeps the glory of existence intact. And globalization, as you know, reduces everything to mere bucks, money. And under this situation, I would like to quote and in this situation, poetry has a very sorry picture to catch. Under the globalization, the wave of globalization, poetry feels stifled. Therefore, at one moment of realization, I myself, being a poet, I also wrote a poem titled The City, in which I talk about the pain and agony of being globalized today. So let me quote a few lines from my own poem, The City. which talks about the pain of being globalized. The city swallows me like a python, with smokes coiling up from greedy chimneys, concrete roofs shearing the chest of the sky, like smolders of fire in the eye, stifling the voice of the breeze as leaves dead drop from autumn trees. Stench from heaps of garbage awful, travel miles of crowded street, killing the vestiges of romantic spirit, forcing us to our lone cells to retreat. You know how difficult it is to stare beyond my window. My window is here, and it's difficult to stare through because on the other side there is a wall. My window is, unless I wriggle out of the stuffy room, smacking of sweat, dried flowers and wounded dreams, my vision interrupted by rising walls, on all sides where to masses of clouds fall, like swooping birds, to land and crawl, before fizzling out as faint mist. We are the unreal denizens here, burrowing holes like rodents of rude night, rarely bothered about seasons cold or heat, as only worries always in our life to retreat. Grueling hunger kills us every moment. We fail to see beyond the yelling lion and belly. Beauty doesn't stir us. Around monuments to rally, we are the voice of the times, growing ripe with our folly. Poetry doesn't move us beyond the traces. History doesn't have meaning beyond the fort's distorted faces. There is romance enough in our skin, not in our soul. We are the Gen Z fed with the virtual to the brim, with hardly anything for tomorrow to dream. Let me slip away. Let me slip away from the high-tech ghetto unseen. Give me some moonbeams, give me some rain, give me some sun rays to see through my pain. Give me some moonbeams, give me some rain, give me some sun rays to see through my pain. This has been a wallowing, this has been a cry in the wilderness of urbanization, industrialization, and globalization. And at the spur of a moment, I felt that this globalized situation also has a very suffocating influence on human beings. So one of the impending dangers of globalization is monopoly not only in the commercial world, but also in the fields of culture, language, food, living style, drinking, family structure, social and mental setup. The world is heading towards utter monotony. Everything is being constructed as a monolithic culture. The hidden and pagan cultures that enrich human experience, the varieties of cultures are swallowed by the big culture. And this is how, due to globalization, creative writing in Indian languages, in Indian native languages, has ebbed, has suffered terribly. Languages are dying due to domination of one language, the language of globalization being English. All other languages are sidelined. The beauty of sentence, the depth of emotion, the sincerity of utterance is difficult to achieve in an alien language. No doubt there is a big boom of this translation industry, with national and international prizes being conferred on translators and translated texts. But the fact remains that much is lost in the process of translation. Translation, as you know, is maybe a beautiful omen, not always faithful. This is somebody has said, I don't say this. So now coming to the state of poetry in general, do we see that people are really interested in poetry? With globalization, common man is in possession of mobile, smartphones, internet, pop music, KFC chicken, McDonald's burgers, fast food. But how many of us are enjoying a poem describing the beauty of the moon in the night, the beauty of nature? Somewhere there is a disconnect between humanity and poetry in this globalized world. Majority seem to be interested in things, not in words. Only a minority seem to be very enthusiastic about poetry. Even those who are reading and writing poetry don't seem to take it seriously. Now you know that there is micro poetry. People don't have time to describe the emotions in elaborate terms by writing 12 lines or 20 lines or 25 lines or 30 lines. Micro poetry, one-liners. I don't say these are bad, but that experiment, as an experiment, it's okay. Even those who are reading and writing poetry don't seem to take it seriously. There are more of casual readings. Instead of poets, there are more of poetasters flooding the poetry pages. Haphazard criticisms, demonstrations of prize-winning poetry certificates on social media. Isn't it a very poor picture of things happening to poetry? Thinking of the past in this context, we know how there used to be times when poetry changed the world, dethroned kings, inspired revolutions. It is no longer so. Traditionally, much value is associated with literature, especially with poetry, because poetry is the essence of literature. There was a writer, famous Italian cultural critic named Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco said that literature is an intangible power and says, I quote, literature keeps language alive as our collective heritage. Literature creates a sense of identity and community, unquote. But today, it doesn't appear that people like things in earnest. The world is governed by huge economic powers. The voice of the poet is frail before the cacophony of the globalized world. We may say that the question of liking poetry seems to be absurd, like the absurdity present in famous modern poet W.H. Auden's poem, The Unknown Citizen, which says, I quote, he was found by the unknown citizen, he was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against whom there was no official complaint. And all the reports on his conduct agree that in modern sense of an old-fashioned world, he was a saint. For in everything he did, he served the greater community and had everything necessary to the modern man. A phonograph, a radio, a car, and a frigidaire. Our researchers into public opinion had contained that he held the proper opinions for the time of the year. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says that the right number for a parent of his generation. And our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should have certainly heard, unquote. So the question is absurd. Whether poetry is a very revealing force, it's an enlightening force, delightful experience. All these questions in these days of globalization seem to be absurd. We may say that the conflicts and melancholy of modern life find full expression in today's poems, but at the same time, this expression has not been able to change much. Poetry does change individual hearts, but the larger scenario seems to be beyond the poetic powers. So let me come to the realm of Hindi poetry a little. to speak about how there has been resistance or acceptance in terms of globalization, accepting globalization. The diverse and enormous consequences of globalization are now starting to show in Hindi poetry too. A well-known Hindi poet named Astabhuja Shukla, in his poems, writes about the changing reality in this era of globalization. He is always with ordinary people who reflect the fear and resentment expressed in this poem, in his poems. In his poem, Upar Upar, this is the poem, Upar Upar, he describes a contradiction that is not visible from the outside. Our Indians are only seen in all brilliant colors or pleasant ways, but the reality is the opposite. The reality is different. So let me quote the poem for you to perceive the irony in this situation, the globalized situation. He says, I quote, ऊपर ऊपर जिसने भी दिखा, ऊपर ऊपर जिसने भी देखा, हर वक्त हरा ही दिखा. ऊपर 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 जिसने भी देखा, हर वक्त हरा ही देखा. समूल उखाड़ने पर ही समझ सके लोग, समूल उखाड़ने पर ही समझ सके लोग कि भीतर गहरे तक मुझ में मूली जैसी सफेदी थी या गाजर जैसी लाली. Unquote. So in another poem titled Bharat घोड़े पे सवार है, he visualizes this globalization as a creator of chaos and awkwardness. This India, that is Bharat, is created by the so-called globalization as an odd horseman. He paints globalization as an odd horseman who is riding on the streets of India, or Bharat, we say. Ancient Bharat, present India, globalized Bharat is India. Unglobalized India is Bharat. So Astabhuja depicts this horseman as a different Indian who doesn't respect its traditional and progressive values. That is what the poet does. So today's globalized Indian is a consumerist creature who doesn't believe in any moral value. So another important Hindi poet, Adam Gondvi, is very famous poet of our times, who not only depicts realities of present days, but also calls people of our country to resist globalization through his famous poems. One of such poems, titled Kabita Mein Vichar, echoes growing contradictions of our globalized society. Dinkar Kumar, another Hindi poet, is also a poet who describes global reality as the poem titled Aswapar Sawar Ghrina, Ghrina, hatred, Ghrina. This Ghrina or hate blackens history, kills human values. Globalization is hate, makes own brothers enemies, creates war within countries and regions. These are some of the poems which are examples of growing resentment against adverse impacts of globalization, as the challenges created by the so-called globalization have multifold dimensions. Its reactions are also not limited to some examples only. There have been acceptance as well as resistance to globalization. Some have accepted and assimilated the language of globalization and gone ahead. There is unification of both the West and the East in terms of harmony, which has been established through writings by some Indians in their literature, in their poetry. And there are many other Hindi poets also who have reacted like that. And There are poets who themselves are also fighting against the challenges through their writings. With the weapon of poetry in particular and literature in general, they are showing their solidarity with the struggling people of our country. So as you know, in this globalized state, the state of poetry is really poetry is caught in an ambivalence, in a dilemma, and we are no doubt fighting to come over the problems of existential and creative dilemmas of globalization through our writings. I think I have given a brief idea about how globalization has impacted poetry throughout the world, and more particularly in India, in our Hindi and English poetry, and in Odia poetry also. There must be such pictures. I'm not gone through in relation to my topic. So if there are any doubts in your mind, I open the questions in the question hour session, as will be instructed by our coordinator, Sukanti ji. You may give your questions, which I will answer in the question answer session.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much,
yes,
everybody. I hope I have tried to express myself, my feelings and ideas about how poetry has been impacted by the globalization. Thank you for giving a patient hearing, all of you. And thanks to the principal sir and Professor Hossain and all other dignitaries who are there. The Department of English, I am grateful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I felt that as if I am in an atmosphere of poetry. That means it is so mesmerizing your speech was, and we were only floating in the midst of poetic atmosphere, a poetic atmosphere. So I cannot more. I have no words to thank you, sir, Padhi sir. Now we will be listening to our honorable guest, Professor Hossain sir, and after his speech, we will have our interactive session when we will invite questions through chat, and I will read out the questions, and both our resource persons will give their answers. So now I request Professor Hossain sir to take over and give his speech or talk on the topic. Now, Professor Hossain sir.
Thank you, madam. Good afternoon. Actually, I feel honored and grateful to the organizers, and you have showered a very generous honor upon me. And you have also honored me by inviting to this international webinar with so many luminaries. I am really grateful to you. On behalf of Dhaka City College, my colleagues of the Department of English, and my students, I express my hearty thanks and gratitude to Mr. Brajokishore Bal sir, Principal of Charampa Degree Mahavidyalaya, Bhadrak, Odisha, Mrs. Satrani Mohanty Madam, Head of the Department of English, Mr. Pitambar Nayak sir, Reader in English, and Dr. Sukanti Mohapatra Madam, Convener of today's international webinar, and an eminent poet. I also express my immense pleasure to share the same platform with Dr. Saroj Kumar Padhi sir, an eminent poet of India who has both national and international accolade and recognition. I feel really privileged to have an opportunity to enjoy sir's insightful and eye-opener discussion on the influence of globalization or impact of globalization on poetry. It's a very elaborate and insightful discussion that has opened lots of horizons to me in which we can explore new things and new ideas there. Actually, I am very much lucky to be acquainted with a few poems of both Padhi ji and Sukanti ji. I hope to read your poems in course of time extensively. And I am very much hopeful that I will write reviews on your poems for Bangladeshi readership. Thank you once again. Now I like to go to my paper. The title of my paper is The Hegemony of English in Post-Colonial Literature and its Aftermath. And I think many things from the discussion of Professor Saroj Kumar sir's paper are common in my paper, and we know that English language has been assimilated in post-colonial countries. We are writing in English, but English in modern perspective or in the realities of the modern world is not able to exercise its absolute hegemony upon the post-colonial nations, because post-colonial nations have already developed their own English. Suppose India has Indianized English. Africa is trying to Africanize English. So in this way, the hegemony of English from the center or metropolis is challenged now. So our English is our English. We are not living in the world of English, we are living in the world of Englishes. So I like to mention some points on this particular topic from my paper. English is the language of power, and in relation with our historiography, it's a language of cultural reproduction, which refers to collective experiences working in favor of the interest of the dominant class, not in favor of the, quote, oppressed groups that are the object of the dominant policies, unquote. Actually, I have quoted this excerpt from Mercado et al.'s famous book, The Hegemony of English. And in his book, Mercado et al. Have said, quote, the purpose of English language education in the contemporary world order cannot be viewed as simply the development of skills aimed at acquiring the dominant English language. His view sustains an ideology that systematically disconfirms rather than makes meaningful the cultural experiences of the subordinate linguistic groups, who are, by large, the objects of language policy. Now, English cannot be read only as a language, but we have to read how it is used to produce, transform, and reproduce meanings. Under the disguise of globalization, the neoliberal policies are working to stamp out wider use of national languages in international interaction. And according to Donald Mercado et al., quote, these policies are consonant with a colonial legacy that had as its major tenet the total deculturation of colonized peoples, unquote. These policies work in the political sites of the so-called third world countries with a view to re-articulating a colonial worldview to deculturate, create gender, class, and racial inequalities. In this connection, one of the most glaring examples is Africa, which is still panting under the weight of de-Africanization policy, in which English has been idealized as a gateway to economic prosperity, good jobs, and productivity. But uncritical assimilation of English as a gateway to economic and technical advancement may risk the local languages, culture, and identity, and lived experiences. Today, English is not a mere language, but a tool of cultural invasion that tends to Disneyfy the world. Culture. Even Antonio Gramsci, in his prison notebooks, warns that while discussing issues emerging out of the relation between the rulers and the common mass, the question of language comes first, because language declines as well as decides the factors working behind the relationship between these two parties. So in the book, The Hegemony of English, Donald McAdoo et al. Have suggested that the tenet, art for art's sake, cannot be applied while talking of the supposed neutrality of English language. It's very crucial for the post-colonial societies who are writing back by using English as a medium. At present, in many post-colonial societies, English enjoys the elitist status, and post-colonial theory does not usually shrink to show how colonizers and an English learning section of the natives used this language to exploit the common mass. In today's world, English is given priority in discussion, while the local languages of the previously colonized people are marginalized. But Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his Decolonizing the Mind, asserts that language is substantially related to culture, and hence it is, quote, the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history, unquote. So language is a memory bank of a people's experience in history. He further declares as language is closely connected with culture and communication, it leads our community to liberation. Even while the post-colonial nations appropriating English have started writing back, the ex-colonial masters distinguish their English from the English of the post-colonial nations. They write their English with capital letter E, while the English of the post-colonial nations is written with a small e. So English, as a language of the present-day imperialists, is still trying to enjoy the status of the big brother. Another crucial point is that the use of English as a medium of writing gives literature an elitist status, and the majority of the local readers do not have any access into it. Thus, in post-colonial literature, English is still exercising its hegemony, not by coercion, but by consent. And this realization is also felt by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, that English is occupying the center and the local languages are marginalized. And in this way, English is still enjoying the status of an apparatus of neo-colonization. Hegemony, as Gramsci defines, is the, quote, cultural, moral, and ideological, unquote, leadership upon the subaltern groups. Let us look back to the history of this subcontinent and learn how the British rulers exercised their linguistic hegemony upon our people. After the establishment of Supreme Court of Judicature at Fort William, Calcutta, now Kolkata, in 1774 by the Regulating Act of 1773, the English needed some copyists and accountants. These positions involved solvency and distinct status in the society. So the people of this area felt tempted to receive English education with a view to enjoying a distinct status in the society. In this connection, Ram Kamal Sen asserts, quote, in 1774, the Supreme Court was established here. And from this period, a knowledge of the English language appeared to be desirable and necessary, unquote. But initially, this word book based knowledge, this phrase is used by Ranajit Guha in his book, Dominance Without Hegemony. This word book based knowledge did not prepare the natives for any important post in the bureaucracy of the Raj. But during the formative phase of the colonial rule political realities, quote, I have quoted a few lines here from Ranajit Guha's book, Dominance Without Hegemony, would force that language into a hegemonic instrument to persuade the subject population about the desirability of its own subjection. Education unfolds, therefore, as an ideological campaign with English assigned, in a variety of discursive forms, the task of committing the colonized to the notion of colonialism as a historically necessary and beneficial development, unquote. In fact, the British Raj did not want to develop India as a nation state, as they did in Europe. Rather, they transformed the local people into subjects, not citizens. Actually, they introduced their education, their culture, their language with a view to transforming the people here into subjects, not into citizens, that they did in their European countries. This process of transformation was geared up by the establishment of Hindu College in 1817 in Kolkata. According to Ranajit Guha, it was a systematic attempt at an institutional level to put, quote, the ideal of mastering a language, unquote, by teaching based on literary texts rather than word books, on lessons in grammar rather than spelling, on writing rather than memorizing, unquote. According to Calcutta Gazette, the aim of this college was to teach the Bengali youths to read English literature, to store their minds with the facts of history and science, and to enable them to express their knowledge in a polished way. This generation, with the values and knowledge of the English stored in their minds, gradually found their own history and age-old tradition inaccessible to them. Thus, English taught through consent, not through coercion, detached the educated Indians from their own historical and cultural realities. In this connection, Ranajit Guha asserts, there was, quote, there was nothing in this education tailored meticulously to fit British imperial interests and the British point of view to allow any distinctively Indian approach to the South Asian past. It would be vain, therefore, to try and seek the impulse for an Indian historiography of India in this education, unquote. So the process of fortifying the hegemony of English and the politics of dehistoricizing the natives in this subcontinent went hand in hand during the British Raj. But English has opened other horizons for the natives. And here again, we must echo with Shakespeare's Caliban in The Tempest. quote, "You taught me your language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse." This is in the words of Bill Ashcroft et al. Quote, "The empire writes back," unquote. And in Ashcroft's phrase, Caliban has become, quote, "an evocative model of the post-colonial subject," unquote. But a question crosses our minds. Can't he do anything other than cursing? Can't he pose a discursive resistance against the cultural imperialism that was promulgated by Macaulay's Minute? We may come to the answers to these questions after examining the role of English literature in the British Empire. Macaulay, in his Minute, put emphasis on transforming the natives of India into a colonial other. And this process of otherization would be done under, quote, "the auspices of English language and culture," unquote. According to Ashcroft, the responsibility of imparting civilized values was imposed upon English literature. Matthew Arnold, in his Culture and Anarchy, defines culture, refuting the anthropologists from the perspective of an idealist. To him, it is, quote, "the study of perfection," unquote. Ironically enough, to be cultured meant to be perfect. So Arnold referred to the purgatorial role of culture. This conception of culture being tainted by the annihilating disposition of the imperial power structure took up the role of imperial culture. As the discipline of English was introduced in the colonies, including India, as a way of teaching the values and culture of the colonizers, inevitably it assumed the role of an, quote, unquote, agent of colonial control. Soon the study of English literature turned into the study of culture or cultural study. English literature also defined and distinguished the cultural identity of the natives by promulgating its superiority as a repository of universal values and aesthetic prominences. Being conquered by this colonial discourse with the auspices of English literature, a section of natives who were once colonized and still imperialized in various forms responded to this promulgation and started writing in the language of power and cultural values. One of the stimuli that works behind this enthusiasm of choosing English as a medium of writing is to become close to the power structure. Still, the recognition of an author is at the hands of the imperialists. Like Robinson Crusoe, they will name the Fridays because the imperial authority of naming is still in their hands. In this connection, George Lemming, a Caribbean author, in his essay, The Occasion for Speaking, proclaims that, quote, "the recognition in America and the considerable financial reward this brought his writing were little consequence compared to the recognition by the literary establishment in London," unquote. This self-criticism of Lemming echoes the realization of a diaspora writer living in Homi Bhabha's phrase, in-betweenness, that Padhi sir has mentioned, dilemma. In-betweenness, which promotes him to assimilate the host culture and at the same time nurture the culture of the place of origin. This ambivalence creates a space for him, and Bhabha has called it third space, which marks his identity as hyphenated identity. third space marks the hybridity which distinguishes not only a diaspora author, but also in the present global perspective, a native author who takes up English as a signifier of superior discursive identity. Thus, according to Bhabha, hybridity is found not only in diaspora, but also in our native writing, because it results from various forms of colonization that leads to intertextuality and intersections, interchanges, and collisions. This hybridity has also got a positive aspect. It, in Bhabha's opinion, enables the post-colonial writers to upset the discourse of imperialism and compromise its claim for superiority, wholeness, and exclusiveness by disclosing its intertextual complicity to various forms of identities. From this understanding, Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o argues that African literature should be written in African languages because he finds the essentialist role of language. In his eyes, there lies an intensive relationship between African culture and African languages. Language, according to him, is culture. Language, for its essentialist role, possesses the power of defining a culture. So the change of language brings about the change of culture. He recounts that the use of English language in African literature marginalizes the local languages, and in the same vein, the Department of English in Nairobi University is described by him as a neo-colonial institution. So he demands the abolition of the Department of English. But the message that he wants to put through his declaration of the abolition of English department is that he wants that the local languages should be set in the center, not in the margin. But he saw quite a reverse picture. English occupied the center and local languages were forced to the margin. By the term abolition, he does not declare a crusade against English. Rather, he wants to set local African languages in the center. Ngugi finds English as one language which cannot colonize all other indigenous languages of the world. So English is a language, English is one of the languages that cannot colonize all other indigenous languages of the world. That was the realization of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He has also found English language in the role of subordinating African literature to European literature. Many critics have dismissed Ngugi's view of English language as essentialist. But Alabi, a post-colonial critic, asserts that, quote, the recuperative trip inside or strategic essentialism is unavoidable if formerly colonized peoples are to compete and participate in the world economy, unquote. To prove their legitimacy of candidature in the competition of manufacturing the commercial and cultural products, they must assume a strategic role, a counterproductive gesture. In this connection, Ashcroft et al. Have asserted that the difference between English and Englishes is blurred, but it is difficult to believe that the metropolis are not sustaining the superior position upon the former colonized nations. Even today, if a person from the so-called third world country with degrees in English intends to pursue higher studies in England, Australia, or America, he or she is to participate in TOEFL or IELTS and obtain required score? Why is his English not accepted as their English? So-called liberalism, which always vacillates between revolution and reaction, is tantamount to neo-colonial policies that promulgate, quote unquote, American English only movement. This American English only movement, this phrase is mentioned by McAdoo et al. In his book, The Hegemony of English, that is American English only. It's a movement which is still working against the post-colonial nations. This movement serves as an ideological yardstick against which all cultural values are measured, including language. It also reminds us of the valuable words of Mexican author Gloria Anzaldúa, who in her semi-autobiography has said, so if you want to really hurt me, I am quoting from her autobiography. So if you want to really hurt me, talk badly about my language, unquote. In the American English only movement, scienticism works in parallel with neo-colonialism. Throughout the post-colonial era, the English language has taken resort to science as an apparatus to rationalize its hegemony. Science promulgates English as its gateway and thus keeps working to cause historical amnesia, dehumanization, and marginalization of ethnicity, culture, and ideologies of different races. Hence, writing in English or in the language of the former colonizers has another considerable limitation too. It keeps a huge non-English speaking local readership out of the texts produced in English. A text works only while it brings about dialogues between the authors and the readers. But how does it achieve its purpose? By keeping a huge number of readers in the bog of inscrutability? Then is it only for letting the former colonizers know that our profit of learning their language is that we can now curse them in their language? I think now it is time to compete with the superpower in economy of the world, and this competition will not be done equally unless and until we who were once colonized involved all our people in this campaign. So to make our text comprehensible both to the domestic and foreign readers, we need to develop an English which should be of our own and which will potently pose a counter-discourse to the Western discursive power structure and its hegemony. Besides, English language, as it is historically evident, was used as a tool by the colonizers to build up a nexus of cultural ways, scientific discoveries, economic impulses, and the imperial power. It, in this way, enabled the West to make ideological claims that it had the superior civilization. In this connection, Srinivas Tilak, in his essay, Hinduism for Hindus, very aptly asserts, quote, the idea of the West became a reality when it was represented to the people of Africa, Asia, and Oceania through colonialism. Colonial education was used to create new indigenous elites to colonize indigenous disciplines of knowledge. This is the realization of Srinivas Tilak, and he has incorporated this idea into his essay, Hinduism for Hindus. This process of colonization was accomplished through imposing a traumatic effect upon the local scholarship with the installation of the tenet of inferiority complex in the psyche of the natives, and through the network of the colonizers' language and historiography, the epistemology of the colonized countries were encased or enslaved. It was done due to the nervousness and trauma on the part of the natives. They allowed their history to be told by the West. It happened to this subcontinent. It happened also in Africa and Oceania, and the West did it by creating an archive with veritable knowledges, philosophies, and images, and employing it upon the natives. So the post-colonial nations must develop a cultural studies of their own, but culture falls into two divisions. One is art, and the other is way of life, quote unquote. Social and institutional frameworks dissolve this gap between art and way of life. These two grow into a singular network through synthesis, and it is maintained through state power. Culture's vulnerability lies in its subjugation to the state power for its momentum and praxis. In this connection, Edward Said asserts, quote, to a great extent, cultural formations and intellectuals exist by virtue of a very interesting network of relationships with the state's almost absolute power, unquote. Said further goes on, quote, nearly everyone producing literary or cultural studies makes no allowance for the truth that all intellectual work occurs somewhere, at some time, on some very precisely mapped out and permissible terrain, which is ultimately contained by state, unquote. In this connection, Bill Ashcroft, in his book on post-colonial futures, has emphatically declared, quote, no writer picking up a pen to write in a colonial language can avoid coming to terms with the irony of this practice at some stage. No post-colonial intellectual, no artist, no critic can avoid the fact that this production is occurring in some already determined discursive space, unquote. The realities of place, publishing requirements, market forms, ideological containments produce an apprehension, and against this apprehension, the post-colonial writers test their capacity. For local identity construction, the post-colonial production appropriates imperial forms, and in this way, it engages itself in global culture. This process is difficult and full of dilemma because it has the risk of distancing post-colonial discourse from the center. This task is also further hardened because of the inherent appropriation of the colonizers' language. But it is also daunting to reject the imperialist discourse, language, and literature, because if it is attempted to do, it will cast him into an illusory space of time and won't let him understand the protean nature of imperial power. Hence, resistance against the imperial power of English can be formed through opposition, not through opposition, but through transformation. This transformation process is adopted by Ngugi through his declaration of the abolition of English department. He gave up English language, but took up the novel form from English literature, produced writings in Gikuyu language, an indigenous language, and then translated them into English. English means Africanized English. And Chinua Achebe has also done the same thing. He has used English language in the framework of Igbo language. So this is called Africanization of the language of the colonizers. And in this way, they have brought about transformation, not opposition, but transformation. They are producing counter discourse. Thus, the post-colonial world will have an autonomous identity. When the post-colonial world will be able to exemplify that more imaginative and literary works are produced from outside England. Now, post-colonial nations' literature is lying in the center of the world literature. Indian English writing and its diaspora literature have already proved it, like some other parts of the world which were previously colonized by the metropolis. Indo-Anglican literature is now writing back the center of English literature. During the post-colonial period, Indian authors like Salman Rushdie, Vikram Sheth, Amitabh Ghosh, Jhumpa Lahiri, Arundhati Roy, Arvind Adiga, and many more diaspora writers are writing in English about India. In Bangladesh, Tahmima Anam, Jia Haidar, Kaisar Haq, Rashid Askari, Monica Ali, Niyamat Imam, and many authors are writing in English. Diaspora literature of this subcontinent has occupied a very concrete and permanent position in world literature. This literature in English is now deconstructing and reconstructing the historiography concocted and distorted by Macaulay, Max Muller, and James Mead, the colonial historiographers. And even English literature produced by the colonial authors like Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Forster, is now challenged by the post-colonial authors of this part of the world. Rudyard Kipling's racially repugnant Kim portrays a caricature of Indian characters like Huri Chandar Mukherjee, in contrast with the so-called glamour of the British Raj. Kipling deliberately overlooks an older and more complex civilization with its own legal culture of India. Actually, I am quoting it from Shashi Tharoor's book, An Era of Darkness. Racially repugnant Kim portrays a caricature of Indian characters like Huri Chandar Mukherjee, in contrast with the so-called glamour of the British Raj. Kipling deliberately overlooks an older and more complex civilization with its own legal culture of India. Actually, that was done by the colonizers very deliberately to distort and dehumanize our history, our identity, our culture. He advocates in favor of the white man's burden. E.M. Forster's A Passage to India very deliberately omits any mention to the formation and development of Indian nationalist movement, and caricatures middle-class man, Dr. Aziz, who is in no way an intellectual and social equal of Englishman, Fielding. The only major Hindu character, Godbole, quote, seemingly cannot conceive of either the kind of Indian like Surendranath Banerjee, who had won entry into the ICS, or the kind like Jawaharlal Nehru, whose critics of empire were challenging the foundations of the Raj, unquote. I have quoted these lines from Shashi Tharoor's book, An Era of Darkness. Now, Amitabh Ghosh's shadow lines and Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, and many more texts of many authors are posing counter discourse against the stultifying limited vision of India. And thus they are potently contributing to the process of the restoration of identity. They are also embracing the whole of India that the colonizers could not. The colonizers only deliberately offered fragmentary pictures and distorted pictures of this subcontinent. But now our writers, our post-colonial writers, Indian writers in English, they are writing back. They are bringing out their history to the world and establishing their identity. And they have also occupied the history of world literature, the center of world literature. So they have challenged the hegemony of English language. We are now writing in Englishes, not in English, only English, capital E, with capital E. True, I like to draw a conclusion of my paper. Linguistic hegemony in this subcontinent had been assisted during the colonial period by curricular practices in colleges and universities. It posed a threat to the cultural unity and plurilingual aura of this subcontinent. The composite of socio-political discourses originated from the local realities is challenged by these practices, which remain obsessed with Western identity and singleness. English, which remained in the core of these practices, itself played the role of a discourse and started working to shape the conditions of knowledge. However, at present, India has developed a new form of English and is very potently challenging the hegemony of the former colonizers' English. In Bangladesh, a new form of English is emerging because of the advent of social media, for example, Facebook, Instagram, and other. Because of globalization, Padhi sir has also mentioned, because of globalization, English is now becoming Englishes, and Englishes are now writing back the English of the English. Universities of the subcontinent are now planning their curricula with prior consideration of the local languages in discursive plan. Language planning in many post-colonial countries is now safeguarding their indigenous languages. Even assimilation of English in the framework of local languages is generating Englishes and powerfully challenging the hegemony of English. It is found in the subcontinent. It is also found in Africa and in many other parts of the world. So now we are now producing Englishes which are challenging the hegemony of English. Actually, this is the content of my paper. Now, let me wait for some questions. I hand over the mic to Madam Sukanti Mohapatra, Madam. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Madam.
This is such an informative session, and I am very much thankful for this time-bound presentation by our resource persons. Now we have enough time for discussion and informative interactive session. So if anyone wants to ask any question, they can unmute themselves. One question has come here. That is by Rabinarayan Panigrahi. So I may please request Rabinarayan Panigrahi sir to unmute himself and ask the question. So questions are invited. We have two resource persons, very prominent and very well informed resource persons. They are scholars and they are in their own fields. So we may invite questions and we may listen to this informative interactive session, which will be informative and insightful, as I hope. So So I invite questions. So that I request webinar and Samapati sir, Panigrahi sir to ask his question.
Good morning, sir. My question was to Dr. S.K. Padhi, sir. Sir, while you were discussing about globalization, impact of globalization, sir, I wanted to know whether the impact on Indian English literature is in terms of language, style, culture, or something else, sir? The kind of influence.
Your question is whether there is only impact on style, language, and culture, or anything else.
Yes, sir. Sir.
Yes, globalization actually is not only affecting a partial thing, it is a total effect. Economy and culture, language, everything is affected through globalization because it is like a big wave. And as Hossain sir has already pointed out, that there are responses in two different ways. One is reaction in terms of resistance, the other one is acceptance. So acceptance has resulted in transforming the language into English says. Africa responded and reacted and resisted, then transformed itself into a language which is African English. Ours is an Indian English, and we have written back to the empire.
Sir.
So we have invented our own language, and our tradition and culture have also been put into English language. English has been assimilated into our a kind of national heritage. It is no more British English that we are reading and writing. We are reading British authors, but we are also reading English, Indian English authors who are as authentic, as original, or more original than the English writers nowadays. Salman Rushdie's books, or Bikram Seth's books, or Anita Desai, or Kiran Desai, or any Sukanti Mohapatra, or anybody for that matter who is writing in English, it represents not only a fraction of influence. Globalization is not only influencing only a part of the society. It has a cumulative and it's a total kind of influence. So everything in there, culture, style, language, and as you know, the language, the regional languages have been impacted, no doubt about it. But there is also mutuality of translation. Regional languages are being translated to English. English books are also being translated into regional languages. There is called cross-cultural, cross-linguistic exchanges, which are enriching it in a different way. Globalization has bad effects, but it has also many good effects. So this is the ambivalent situation where you cannot reject something, nor can you totally, blindly, uncritically, as Hossain sir was telling, uncritically accepting a language is also problematic. You have to be very critical, aware, conscious when you are dealing with language and literature. That is my answer to Robida and Panigrahi sir.
Thank you, sir. Beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Now, any more question? If anyone wants to ask any more questions, so you know this is also included in our third year English course and honors course. So if any student wants to ask any question, again.
Madam, I shall ask.
Yes, sir. You are cordially invited to ask questions. You are very much welcome.
Yes. My question to Hossain sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Yes.
due to globalization of English literature, so our original culture gradually decreasing day by day, generation after generation. Is it true? Can we save our culture through English literature?
Sir, thank you very much for your question, sir. Actually, in the age of globalization, globalization may also be termed as neo-colonization. That is, it is under the disguise of colonization. The colonization is still working under the disguise of globalization. And globalization has also branded some countries, third world countries, who are economically backward. So they are calling some countries third world countries. In this way, they are still branding us. And in the name of cooperation, in the name of help, they are still trying to exercise their hegemony, political hegemony, economic hegemony, cultural hegemony upon the post-colonial nations. And it is quite natural that there is always a dialogue or interaction between different nations or different races of people. So a kind of a hybridization is going on. So we are living in the age of hybridization also. But we, suppose Frantz Fanon has said regarding language, that while we take up language of a particular nation, we take up its culture. So colonization is more of psychological than of economic or political. So I think it is the responsibility of post-colonial nations, and it is also a question of consciousness regarding our roots, regarding our cultural realities, historical realities. So while assimilating or interacting with the culture of the colonizing nations, we have to be conscious of the originality of our own culture. We must assimilate, we must accommodate, we must synthesize, but we must not annihilate our roots. So we want assimilation, we welcome synthesis, we also welcome hybridity, but we do never welcome annihilation. We do never annihilate our culture. We are Indians, we are Bangladeshis. This is our root, this is our identity. We can welcome different cultures. We can develop interaction with them, but we must not annihilate our cultural identity. So it should be done very carefully. And I think the post-colonial writers are doing this thing very carefully. And if we read the fictions, Indian fictions in English or Bangladeshi fictions in English or writing in English, we find that these writers are presenting or exposing their own culture. They have assumed the English language, but the content or the nucleus or the gist is the local identity, the local cultural identity, local political realities. So I think though we are living in the age of hybridity, we should be conscious of our originality. We welcome synthesis, but we must not welcome annihilation of our culture, our identity. Thank you, sir, for your question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Now, if any more questions is from anyone, they are allowed to ask.
Madam, I have a question. Myself, Dr. Swarnamai Purohit from Lakshmi Narayan College, Harsuguda. May I audible, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
This is a question to Professor Hossain. Sir, as we find it, that gradually the Department of English with capital E, it is going to be abolished. And as you have highlighted, that we are going to have the departments of cultural studies. And as I feel that these departments are already vogue in different universities of the world. And in that way, we find that different English literatures have already been introduced to these departments. And but what do I feel that the same pedagogical tools are used in these departments. So, sir, my question is that should we not take some new tools, new pedagogical techniques to teach these new subjects like translation studies and different other regional literature also in these departments of cultural studies? So my question is, should we adopt new pedagogical tools to teach these new subjects in the departments of cultural studies, sir?
Yes, madam, thank you very much for your question. Actually, of course, we have to develop our new way of criticism. Suppose a few days ago, I asked one of my friends who teaches Bangla literature. I asked him, do you interpret Bengali literature or with your own hermeneutics techniques? And then he answered me that he did not know the local or native approaches. He still approaches Bengali literature while citing it, Marxist approach or new criticism or a new historicist approach or post-structuralist approach. So I think while we are approaching our literature, our culture, while we are approaching our critical works with the framework of the theories provided by the West, it is a kind of recolonization. And Ole Soyinka, in his book, Myth, History and African World, in this book, in the preface to this book, Ole Soyinka has said that while we are using Western pedagogy, criticizing our own literature or epistemology, it is one kind of recolonization. So we have to develop our own way of seeing the things or criticizing our epistemology. And I think in this space we are to work. We have still some works, but it is not sufficient. I think we should work in this particular space so that we can interpret ourselves with our own framework of knowledge or framework of theories. Thank you, madam.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Now there is a question by our third year honor student, Vaishnavi. She wants to ask that if globalization is worldwide, Padhi will reply that if globalization is worldwide, then how Indian literature or Indian poetry and other literature is affecting the literature of the world?
It's a mutual process. Actually, Indian literature has already been accepted. If Salman Rushdie gets Booker Prize, is it not a recognition that is given to Indian English literature? If Arundhati Roy has got Booker Prize, is it not a recognition? Rabindranath Tagore got Nobel Prize. So many Western countries, the West has come to accept Indian English writing, which is in fact rich. It is glorious. It is significant. It cannot be ignored. So Indian English writing is occupying a major space in all the Englishes that are being written, including the capital E English. So this is a mutual kind of influencing which globalization has created. English writings are also acknowledged, also expressed, are also recognized, rewarded, awarded. So everything is happening. So it's a mutual process. Globalization has brought in this mutual process.
Yes, sir, that is fine. So any more question if anyone want to ask, or we will shift to our next program. So any question from anyone? So now I will ask, if there is no question from anyone, then we may end the section with vote of thanks. But before that, I would like personally to thank Professor Elham Hossain sir, Dr. Saroj Padhi sir. Those are my friends in Facebook, and I have seen them, I have invited them, and they have accepted so kindly, so graciously. And with their presence and such scholastic and brilliant discussion, they have just mesmerized us. They have just made us spellbound. So I am particularly thankful to you, sir, for such brilliant presentation and for coming and accepting my invitation. So looking forward to see you more if any more discussion sessions will be arranged by us in future. Now I ask our esteemed colleague, my esteemed colleague Pitambar Naik sir, to deliver the vote of thanks before we close the meeting.
Thank you, ma'am. At the outset, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed principal sir, Professor Bhadrak Ball, a leading botanist of Odisha. Sir, your active support and cooperation has always inspired us and encouraged us to organize this international webinar during a time of COVID-19 pandemic period. Thank you very much, sir. Next, my HOD madam, Professor Satirani Mahanti, who is ever loving and affectionate, and see the inspiring brain behind organizing this seminar. Madam, you have always been a very precious asset for our department. Thank you very much for your active support and cooperation. Next, I would like to come to Dr. Sukanti Mohapatra, madam, the chief architect behind organizing this seminar. Madam, your wisdom, skill and hard work has always brought us a lot of pride and glory. Thank you very much, madam, for organizing this international webinar. Next, the chief attraction of this webinar, Professor Dr. Saroj Kumar Padhi, sir, Associate Professor of JKBK Govt College, Cuttack. Sir, you have got a very good name and fame, not only in Odisha, not only in India, also abroad, as a leading poet, critic, editor, and an outstanding academician. And you are from Cuttack, the hub of art, literature, and all kinds of cultural activities. Sir, I express my heartfelt gratitude to you on behalf of my department. Sir, your intellectual discourse and skillful analysis on impact of globalization on poetry has profoundly impressed us. Thank you very much, sir. Next, I would like to come to the prime attraction of this webinar, Professor Dr. Elham Hossain, sir, from Sonar, from Bangladesh, from the land of love and literature, from the land of Dr. Mujibur Rahman. Sir, we are deeply moved by your eloquence, by your oratory, by your intellectual discourse, and your speech on hegemony of English in post-colonial literature and aftermath has really mesmerized us. And your presence in this webinar, we feel very much honored. Your presence in this webinar has really honored us. Thank you very much, sir. Next, my dear friends and respected participants, and my dear loving students also, your active participation is quite inspiring, and you have made this webinar a grand success. Thank you very much, sirs and madams. Next, my dear student Draksha Kalpana, thank you for your sweet and melodious introductory song. Last but not the least, it is our dear Ankit. Thank you very much for your successful planning and coordination, for your technical support. Thank you very much, sir. Namaskar.
Now, before closing the meeting, I express again my namaste to everyone else, those participants and dignitaries who are present here. Now, this is actually this is a very good session that we have already experienced in this platform. And just before closing, I again express my gratitude. Pitambar sir has already told what is due for this occasion, and now I ask for your permission to close the meeting. Now, Madam Sati, Madam, do you want to say anything?
Thank you all. Thank you all the participants and dignitaries. Thank you.
Now, okay, ma'am, this is on record. and I will upload it to YouTube, and I will send it personally to Elham Hossain sir and Saroj Kumar sir to their mail, this recording. And our college website also have this recording. It started a little later from Satya Madam's talk, but all the resource persons talks and question answer session till now, it is being recorded. And for feedback, I will give the link in the WhatsApp group. So participants, don't worry, the link is there also in the chat. Now, before closing the meeting, I express my gratitude and thanks to all of you. Now, namaste. Now, let me
Thank you.
Namaste. Namaste to all. Hossain sir, Saroj sir, namaste.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.
I will be photo with you. Now, Ankit is taking a photo. A photo with you.
Ankit and Kalpana, you must appear in the screen.
Ankit to screen caps.
Okay.
Now it's okay. Let me close the meeting, sir. Principal, sir.
Thank you all.
Sir, allow me to close the meeting.
Yes.
Sir, namaste, sir. Padhi, sir. Hossain, sir.
Namaste.
Namaste. See you again.
Sir, namaste. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Closing.
Hey, phone kar.
Sir. Close.